Okay, so I am Chelsea Davis. I hold a PhD in English literature. My scholarship has focused on the American Gothic and horror film. I now work as a writer and an independent scholar, and I'm at work on a series of essays about color and horror film. But the seed for those essays and also for this talk, I want to acknowledge, comes from a panel that I sat on earlier this year at the Friends of Genre convention. I sat on that panel with some great scholars, and my conversation's very indebted to them. Their names are E.M. Markoff, L.S. Johnson, and Ramona Lyons. So thanks to all of them. And I also want to give a brief content warning that I will be showing a couple clips in this presentation that have blood in them. So if that's troubling to you, I will give you fair warning before those clips show up. So you're welcome to look away or turn the sound off. Just realized I started at the end. We have to start at the beginning. So first of all, why? Why should we pay attention to color and horror? We might actually think it's a little bit of a counterintuitive pairing after all. Color is the part of the light spectrum that we can see, and horror is so often interested in the opposite, the invisible, or at least the dark, the black, the obscure, and the shadow. But I want to argue, of course, that while obscurity and shadow are part of the story of the Gothic, that's far from the whole picture. And then we miss out on a lot if we don't also pay attention to color. For one thing, I think we can think about color and horror as being kind of inherently twinned together because they're both inherently very sensory. They do things to our bodies and give us physiological responses beyond our control. The film scholar Linda Williams calls horror one of the three body genres. So along with pornography and melodrama, horror makes us feel things when we look at the screen, and not just feel things, but emote in certain ways. So we might scream or gasp or shiver when we see something happen to a body on the screen. And as we'll see, it's for this very reason of their kind of shared sensuality that color and horror have been greeted by the same kind of pearl clutching and criticism throughout the history of art. As much as color and horror speak to our bodies, they also speak to our minds. And they speak in a similar language, that of the unconscious. So and when I say that, I'm actually paraphrasing Carl Jung, who wrote that colors are the mother tongue of the subconscious. It's very well established in studies of cognition, for instance, that color is the first thing we notice about an image. And that color operates on us in ways we might not always be aware of, for instance, raising our heart rate or lowering it. And if there's one thing that horror is interested in, it's making our heart beat faster. So for that reason, it's not that surprising that the unconscious has also been one of the most common theoretical touchstones for talking about the Gothic. As Fred Botting sums up, the Gothic is a fiction of unconscious desire, a release of repressed energies and antisocial fantasies. So color and horror both dredge something up in us. And finally, there are also historical reasons to draw the connection between color and horror. As we'll see very shortly, the earliest filmmakers linked color to the genres of the fantastic, so horror, sci-fi, and fantasy from the earliest days of color film onwards. So with those frameworks in mind, here's where we'll go today. We'll take a little bit of a stroll through the early history of color and horror film. We'll talk about chromophobia, so Western art's tradition of distrusting and disliking color. We'll talk about the opposite, chromophilia, or horror filmmakers who choose to embrace color in the full sort of Roji Biv spectrum. We'll discuss what I think are the three most important contexts to think about when we read a color in a given film. And we'll end with a couple remarks on color in horror fiction. So to begin with, let's review the timeline of color in horror film from a technological standpoint. If we really want to get to the earliest origins of spooky moving colors on the screen, we actually need to start with the Magic Lantern show. This was a form of entertainment technology invented in the 1650s by a Dutchman, and it grew in popularity in England and the US throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So as you can see in the illustration here, this was a device that used a small mirror to direct light through an illustrated piece of glass and onto a blank wall or screen. The projectionist would sort of narrate along with the images, and he quite often would also rotate between two images to simulate a kind of motion. And here in the middle, we have an authentic Magic Lantern slide illustration that was popular in the 1880s. And as the term magic lantern implies, these shows were inherently uncanny for early audiences. They weren't used to seeing moving illustrated images. There were no cartoons, no movies. So in other words, the way I think of it is that there's actually something supernatural about the very technology of the moving image. And as you can see in all three of our images, although not all magic lantern shows were using the visual vocabulary of the Gothic, the slides often did specifically feature devils and demons and other images of hell. Now, if we move on to color film itself, which is invented in the late 19th century, I personally, in researching this project, was surprised to learn how long color has been a presence in film. Like many of you, perhaps, when I first started researching this project, I actually associated early silent film almost exclusively with black and white. But as it turns out, by the 1920s, 80% of movies could be seen in some sort of color. Color was actually more common than black and white for super early cinema. And it's an understandable misconception to think that most of those early films were in black and white, and it comes from the fact that color film degraded really easily in those days. So the surviving films that we do have are mostly in black and white. But in any case, for that reason, I've subtitled this part of the talk, Your Fave is Polychromatic, because there's a good chance that your favorite early horror film was actually in color in some form. Now, the color that was present in those early films was not the Technicolor of Dorothy and Toto, I should say. That film color would have instead been applied after the shooting of the film instead of during the film, and it was often very limited to like 1 to 3 tones, basically. So the early instance of color in any film crops up in 1895, and shortly after that, we get our first color horror film, 1897's The Haunted Castle by Georges Méliès. And you might recognize Georges Méliès from films like the slightly later Trip to the Moon, a film that was also originally released in color, and which, like The Haunted Castle, also falls into a genre of the fantastic. It's, of course, more science fiction or fantasy than horror, but I think those things are still connected under that umbrella term of the fantastic. The Haunted Castle, which you see an image of on the left, was hand painted, and the studio that did the hand painting was belonged by a woman who had actually gotten her start painting magic lantern slides. So you can see that there's this sort of seamless through line between magic lanterns and early film. The Haunted Castle, which we will watch in its entirety in a moment, portrays an aristocratic gentleman garbed in red who undergoes various sort of silly supernatural torments. And you'll mainly see in this film the color red in the guy's outfit and a couple small accents in the background. So again, nowhere near Dorothy and Toto Technicolor yet. This is about a 30-second clip. So it's a little dark, but basically he's preparing to sit down in a chair. Now the chair has been spectrally taken away from him. Ghost of some kind appears. So there's really a playfulness here to the spookiness. Méliès, who's actually playing the aristocratic man, the star of this movie, he's clearly having a lot of fun with the medium. And it's precisely that convergence of the supernatural and the playful, as I sort of hinted before, that the first filmmakers really capitalized on color to convey. And this is in part because the early colors that were used in film were so bright or otherwise kind of unrealistic that they wouldn't have been very believable in realist genres like the war film or the romance, although there are some examples of those genres using color as well. But primarily it was the genres of the fantastic, like horror, sci-fi, fantasy, which were called fairy films at the time, that grasped onto color as a way to exploit what's been called the dreamlike qualities of early cinema, or nightmare-like in the case of horror. So hand painting, as you might imagine, was extremely time intensive because each frame was being painted by hand, sometimes with a brush as small as a single camel hair. So the other early method of colorizing film was far less laborious. This was known as tinting, also known as toning, in which the entire film reel, after it had been shot, was dipped in dye in post-production. And I think you might be interested to learn that some of the great classics, for instance, of German expressionist cinema, which many people sort of associate with the genre as being the genre of black and white and kind of high drama, shadows, stark contrast between the black and white, those films were often actually color tinted in their original versions. So this is from Robert Wiene's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, which was originally a color film via tinting. The film used this sort of soft pink that you see on the left for its traditionally feminine, innocent, domestic-minded heroine. It used blue for night scenes. And most importantly, and interestingly, I think it used this kind of sickly, unsettling color for its mad Dr. Caligari. And I think the reason that's noteworthy is that it's using a color in association with characters in a way that shows us that film has already gone beyond using color as sort of purely decorative flourish or add-on. It's not just for fun anymore. We're being told something about the character. And I'll talk about this a little bit later when I discuss what I call narrative conditioning. This is F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, a 1922 adaptation of Dracula. And many of you probably are familiar with the image on the left. It's sort of the iconic shot of the movie of the vampire Nosferatu creeping up the staircase about to attack the heroine in the final climactic scene. But this on the right is actually what it would have looked like to original audiences. It was tinted in blue since it's a night scene instead of in grays and blacks. And I think it's worth taking a pause to consider how the sort of emotional register of this scene changes when you personally as a viewer see the black and white versus the blue image. I think I would include myself in this number. A lot of modern viewers might see the blue image as a little less scary, maybe even goofy, because we tend to associate black and white incorrectly, as it turns out, with kind of capital S serious filmmaking. And it has a sort of whiff of aesthetic prestige along with it that I think color doesn't. By the 1920s, an early two-color process had been invented, and so that allowed directors to imprint greens and reds only directly onto the film as they were shooting, so no need for post-production now. But this was such an expensive technology that most films that used it just opted to use it for a very short segment. They shot the rest in black and white. And this was the strategy taken up by Rupert Julian when he did a 1925 adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera. This was a silent feature film, mostly shot in black and white, but it has 17 minutes of color. And those 17 minutes are really well chosen. They're a spectacular, fanciful scene of a masquerade ball. And in the clip that we're about to watch, we'll see this sort of joyful masquerade interrupted by the Phantom of the Opera himself, who has climbed up from the area underneath the opera house where he usually lives to sort of interrupt the party. And he's garbed in this bright red. And you'll see that although there are red accents in the other masquerade goers' costumes, the monochromatic nature of the Phantom's costume still really commands the attention of the camera and of the audience. Some of you might have put together that this scene is an allusion to Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Masque of the Red Death, which is also a tale of an opulent ball that's sort of interrupted by the arrival of an unpleasant figure garbed in red. In that short story, he is the Red Death, a plague personified. And although the Phantom's red costume signals clearly danger and death in the context of this film's narrative, what's interesting to me is that the color accumulated really, really different connotations in promotional campaigns for the Phantom of the Opera. Universal Studios actually used this red hue from the Phantom's costume in coordinated marketing campaigns for clothing, milkshakes, and cosmetics. So much so that so-called Phantom Red, as you'll see that phrase pop up on the two advertisements here, it became a household name. And by the time this happened, by the time Phantom Red was being used to sell lipstick as a beauty product to women, I think the color, it's fascinating that the color had taken kind of a 180-degree turn from its original association with the ugly, appalling face of the Phantom. By 1932, a three-color process of Technicolor had been invented, so that's what finally gives us the full Roy G. Biv spectrum. But again, remains so expensive, fairly rare to use it except in short clips in a film, and that is the strategy taken up by the film, The Picture of Dorian Gray, the adaptation of Oscar Wilde's novel that came out in 1944. And this is an interesting case study because most of the film is shot in black and white. Only the shots of Dorian Gray's portrait, which represents his sort of decaying moral self, only those shots are in color, as you can see on the right here. And I think that's fascinating because what it means is that bright color, somewhat counterintuitively, I think, is actually being used to signal corruption instead of beauty, instead of the loveliness that we usually associate with color. And I've noticed a bit of a pattern that I've been calling polychromatic perversity, which I call this sort of device of using a kaleidoscope of vibrant colors in association with a sort of decadently evil character. And horror of this variety seems to be suggesting that kind of too much material pleasure may actually have a sinister, decaying effect on the person who's having too much fun. And other examples of this are The Mask of the Red Death, Roger Corman's 1964 adaptation, and The Love Witch, Anna Biller's film from 2016. Finally, by the 1950s, Technicolor was affordable, relatively affordable, and so color finally became the norm at this point. And I think it's no accident that Hammer horror began its meteoric rise to fame during this decade. Hammer horror films were produced by a British studio, and they became notorious for their kind of hyper gory and eventually hypersexual adaptations of monster movies like The Mummy, Dracula, and The Werewolf. And the sensory overload of these films relied really heavily on bright colors, which they emphasized through high-key lighting. The first horror film shot entirely in Technicolor was indeed a Hammer picture, 1957's Curse of Frankenstein by Terence Fisher. And in this movie, when you watch it, you really notice the way that blood pops off the screen. And I think early audiences would have noticed it too. Blood hadn't popped off very much when it was being shot in black and white. It just looks like a dark substance. And in this era in particular, on-screen blood was very eye-catching because the fake blood that effects artists were using was made from this super artificial looking combination of mineral oil and pigment. You've seen it before if you've watched any film from like the 50s or the 60s. And I'm gonna play a short clip that gives us a sense of what that blood looked like on screen. So this is one of the clips that does portray bloodshed. It's about 10 seconds if you're not interested in watching. Victor Frankenstein has shot his creation. And this clip is not really all that shocking to us, or at least if you watched horror or action films before. But remember that it's the convergence of color plus gore that would have been very new to audiences of the 50s. And so the sensationalism of that really launched this film and then Hammer horror in turn more broadly to instant box office success. But that's not to say that reviewers were crazy about it. In fact, most critics actually found the Technicolor violence to be tasteless. And here's a review that really highlights the way that color played a really central role in that perception of horror violence as inappropriate. This is a review that came out from the Sunday Express, a London newspaper in 1957. The color that Hammer films are obviously so pleased about is red. It is drenched over the screen in the shape of luscious blood dripping from severed hands, gouged eyes, decapitated heads. By comparison, an abattoir is a rather friendly place. And now that we've finished our little tour through early horror cinema, I want to expand a little bit more on the specific kind of objection to color that's reflected in that review. Because as I mentioned in the introduction to my presentation, there's a long tradition in Western art history and criticism of demeaning and fearing color as an aesthetic choice. This was the case in film, in painting, architecture, photography. Color was, until quite recently, often framed by art critics as a superficial, vulgar, and even morally degrading aspect of visual art when compared to other aspects of images such as form. And this is the tradition that goes all the way back to Immanuel Kant, if not earlier than that. So much so that David Batchelor has dedicated an entire book to this phenomenon called chromophobia. Early critics of color and film in particular, among other things, were worried that the addition of color to film would induce eye strain in audiences. And this rumor persisted until Technicolor the Technicolor company finally sponsored a scientific study that concluded that no, color film actually, inverse to that, causes less eye strain in audiences. But regardless, even after that study was released, as film scholar Joshua Umibe writes, color film was thought to have unbridled libidinous power over primitives, queers, women, and children. Color and its effects were thought to be dangerous, and like the sensuous body that it appeals to, it must be controlled, uplifted, repressed. And to those of you who study Gothic literature, those anxieties may sound familiar, because in the 18th and 19th centuries, conservative reviewers feared that Gothic novels would corrupt the minds and inappropriately excite the vulnerable bodies of women, children, and poor people. So I know that I'm implicitly framing these critiques of color and of horror as a little bit silly, and they usually are. But that's not to say that there isn't sometimes something to the idea that less is more when it comes to color. After all, a couple of the most acclaimed horror directors of all time have made the choice to film in black and white, even when color was widely available. And a good case study of this strategy succeeding somewhat accidentally is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. This black and white masterpiece was released in 1960, by which point Hitchcock had already made 9 feature films in color. So it wasn't for lack of knowing how to use the technology that he chose black and white. In part, I have to admit, Psycho was shot in grayscale due to budgetary concerns. Hitchcock was really on a shoestring for Psycho, but he was almost certainly also doing something a little more philosophical with his choice, which was trying to soften the relatively shocking violence of this film to get it around censors. He would have been aware of the critical backlash that had greeted films like The Curse of Frankenstein, and probably sensed that the famous shower scenes, shots of a knife penetrating Marion Crane's stomach, among other things, these were unprecedented and would have not just shocked audiences, but maybe made it onto the cutting room floor altogether if people were made to see that kind of violence with crimson blood flowing down the drain. I think an interesting factoid, though, is that some people who originally saw Psycho in theaters later remembered having seen that scene in color. So they swore to God that they had seen red swirling down the drain, which I think speaks to the fact that Hitchcock was kind of right in his gamble. He was right that that kind of brutality would make a shocking impact on people, whether or not it was in color. So, okay, this next slide, by the way, is going to have a brief GIF of blood. It will last about 10 seconds, I think. What would Hitchcock's film have been like if he had chosen to shoot in color? Unfortunately, that's not a hypothetical question, because Psycho was remade in full color in 1998 by Gus Van Sant to almost universal disdain. And there were a lot of reasons for this backlash, of course, but one of them was absolutely Van Sant's choice to add color to the picture. Now, I personally actually think the kind of muted pastels that the cinematographer chose for Van Sant's film, I thought that was kind of a lovely color palette, but it does definitely make for a big departure from the kind of, I don't know, old school Gothic atmosphere of the original. And it's for that reason that I think most critics ended up agreeing with film scholar James Narramore, who wrote of Van Sant's adaptation, that the color photography in the new film creates a kind of noise or extra layer of information that obscures the abstract, geometric quality of Hitchcock's work. But as I mentioned earlier, I do think there's a little bit of temporal bias at play that Narramore is not really fessing up to. And the fact is that black and white is often going to have a sort of classic Hollywood look to our eyes, and that whiff of aesthetic prestige that comes along with it. And I think black and white is still used to this day in part for that reason by horror filmmakers. But it can also be used when they want to transport the audience to a bygone era. For instance, that's the case for Robert Eggers's The Lighthouse, which is set during the 19th century. It's also the case for Eggers's other film, incidentally, The Witch, a period piece set in the 17th century. And I should say that in The Witch, Eggers doesn't actually abandon color altogether, but he does use a very desaturated palette and almost exclusively natural lighting when he was shooting the film, which, as you can see in the image on the right from The Witch, ends up having this look that's so grayscale that it's almost truly black and white. And in both of these movies, I think the lack of saturated color is used to convey not just antiquity, that bygone era feeling, but also the profound bleakness of the characters' lives. So in The Lighthouse, the characters spend their days doing hard manual labor to man a lighthouse and kind of basically slowly going insane from the sea and other factors. And in The Witch, a small family is dying of starvation and religious zealotry at the edge of the woods. But a third recent horror movie used grayscale, I think, not just for the sense of desolation that it conveys, but also to thematically link itself to another genre, particularly associated with black and white, namely film noir. So this is 2016's, oops, spoiler alert. This is 2016's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which transports the sort of visual and moral shadows of film noir to a vice-ridden Iranian city that's besieged by a vampire. And these are all gorgeous films, but let's not forget that sometimes more is more, because other horror films have successfully wrangled the full spectrum to mesmerizing and terrifying effect. And I call the umbrella we're about to talk about color maximalism. One form of color maximalism in horror is used to generate a mood of heightened emotion and surrealism. This is the case with giallo films. This is a variety of Italian horror film that saw its heyday in the 1970s. The word giallo means yellow in Italian, which refers to the yellow, pulpy paperback novels on which these films were often based, and you'll see an example of such novels on the left-hand side. And this film genre paired super over-the-top gore, over-the-top acting, over-the-top music with this decadent rainbow of sets and lighting and costuming. And the effect is often a very psychedelic nightmare. It's sort of actually epitomizes the ethical quandary at the heart of all horror film, I think, which is that when we watch a giallo movie, we're watching appalling violence, terrible things happening to bodies on screen. But we're also watching violence that's made to look kind of sickeningly beautiful through devices like color. And there's maybe no film that better exemplifies that ethical quandary than Dario Argento's 1977 film, Suspiria. In this movie, just to give you, not that it really matters because it's so insane, but the brief plot rundown is that an American woman travels to Germany to go to ballet school and discovers that the ballet school has been taken over by a coven of witches. And this fairy tale plot is matched by a fairy tale color palette, as you can see here. And Argento's movie was one of the last films to be processed in Technicolor. And not only that, it also explicitly took inspiration from an early Technicolor film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, so hence Suspiria's palette of primary hues and blacks. The film's cinematographer, Luciano Tovoli, generated the film's insanely vivid colors by shining these extremely strong lights through tissue paper and cloth, instead of just slapping sort of a gel filter on the light as would normally be done. And I want to show you what that looks like in action. So I'll show you a clip from the film's final scene. The protagonist, Susie, has discovered the bedroom of the ballet school's head witch and is going to try to kill her. Surprisingly, for a giallo film, I tried to choose a clip without any bloodshed, so you're good. If blood isn't your thing, you can still watch this clip.
Adesso tu conoscerai la morte. Verrà a prenderti. Ma che volto avrò? Come vedrai, Elena Marcos.
Don't go in there, Susie. Luciano Tovoli, the cinematographer, had this to say about the color palette he chose for that scene and for the movie more broadly. A horror film brings to the surface some of the ancestral fears that we hide deep inside of us. And Suspiria would not have had the same cathartic function if I had utilized the fullness and consolatory sweetness of the full color spectrum. I used the usually reassuring primary colors only in their purest essence, making them immediately surprisingly violent. And I think this quotation gets at the three-way link I tried to draw at the beginning of this presentation between color, horror, and the unconscious. Horror brings things to the surface, but so does color. Now, there's at least one other major species of color maximalism in horror, that which we see in daylight horror. This subset of horror inverts our usual associations between the genre and nighttime, giving us narratives where very bad things happen in the broad light of day. And recently, this subgenre has gotten a lot of attention thanks to Ari Aster's Midsommar, the film pictured here. Ari Aster said of making this film, "We wanted the film to feel like that three-strip Technicolor process." But a long tradition of daytime horror actually predates this film. And here are a couple of examples. The Birds, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Heavenly Creatures, and Annihilation. So why is daylight horror scary? On a purely thematic level, of course, it suggests that you're never safe, not even in the daylight. But I think that daytime horror is also aesthetically unsettling because of its uncanny juxtaposition of happily colored settings and very unhappy events. And in terms of those settings, daylight horror most often tends to highlight the spookiness, I think, of the natural world, or specifically its sort of indifferent, cold beauty. Notice the vivid greens and blues on all four of these slides. These meadows and skies will soon be the mute settings for horrific violence. After all, even the most beautiful forest doesn't care about the countless deaths of creatures that it witnesses every day. And so what if those creatures happen to be humans this time? Because it inverts most people's traditional associations between the colors of nature and a tranquil mood, I think that daytime horror is a really healthy corrective to a kind of lazy tendency to read color symbolism in film. What I think of as the Cliff Notes style of reading color, where we really quickly conclude that like X color symbolizes Y idea or emotion in a film every time it shows up, no matter what the film is. As Sarah Street and Joshua Umebe write, though, what has always defined color is its mutability. So springtime in one context is a deathly pallor in another. What exactly do they mean by context? Umebe and Street don't go on to explain, but in my opinion, there are three contexts that it's most important to consider when we're trying to read how a color is operating in a given horror film. The first is physiological. So what are that hue's inherent biological effects on us when we see it? Getting back to that claim I made in my introduction that color and horror both operate directly on our bodies. For an example of this first kind of context, we can look to the color red, horror's favorite color, of course. And unsurprisingly, there will be blood on the next slide. Physiologically, the color red raises our blood pressure and heart rate, and studies show that when someone wears red, we view them as more aggressive. So you can see right out the gate why this makes red a perfect match for horror. And we'll recall that red's kind of center stage presence in horror stretches all the way back to the Phantom of the Opera, and even further back than that to Méliès's film The Haunted Castle, arguably the first color horror film. The second context to consider when you're reading a color in a film is narrative conditioning, my term. So this is the way a film or story kind of trains us, like Pavlov's dogs, to associate a given color with a certain mood, character, theme, or event every time that that color appears. And among the most famous examples of this technique is Hitchcock's 1958 thriller Vertigo. The color green barely appears at all in the film until its mysterious leading lady, Madeline, is introduced in this scene we're about to watch. And what an introduction it is. So Madeline's green dress quickly stands out from the drab palette of the other diners around her. And she also stands out from the red walls of the restaurant, even though red is, physiologically speaking, the more arresting color to us. We haven't even seen her face yet, and we are still transfixed like Scotty, the character played by Jimmy Stewart that we just saw at the bar. And after this point, green becomes the color of Madeline in the film and of the protagonist Scotty's vertiginous, all-consuming obsession with her. And a little spoiler alert for Vertigo, but the presence of this color also tips us off later in the film that a woman claiming to be a woman named Judy is in fact Madeline in disguise. Because she's wearing green, we know as the viewers that she's in fact Madeline. And the third and final context that I think it's really important to consider when we think about color in a film is the historical and cultural associations of a given color. And for an example of this, we can consider the color yellow. So if you look up this color in a Western European or an American decorating guide, you'll probably find that it's most often associated with sunny themes. So happiness, innocence, youth, hope, daffodils. An example of a film that uses yellow along these lines is Guillermo del Toro's 2015 Gothic romance, Crimson Peak. The heroine of this film, Edith, wears yellow. She has yellow hair, and she's shot in yellow hues while at home in America, where she's safe and comfortable and allowed to remain innocent. And we eventually come to see that yellow underscores Edith's relative naivete and the naivete of America as a young nation. Now, by contrast, the incestuous villainess of the film, Lucille, is passionately angry and lusty, and most sinisterly of all, European. And we know this in part because she's costumed in a striking red and lives in a mansion, the eponymous Crimson Peak, which is sort of slowly sinking into this bubbling bed of red clay, which you can see in the image on the far right. But the color yellow also reminds us that we're not always getting the full picture if we only look at one of the three kinds of color context in isolation from the other two. Because yellow has also consistently served in many horror narratives as exactly the opposite of innocence. It's served as an indicator of disease, physical decay, and moral degradation. For instance, we'll recall this use of the color from the Mad Dr. Caligari in Vina's film, as well as the self-aware kind of pulpy luridness of giallo paperback covers. And for a third example of this, we can finally shift our focus from film to literature, to Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. In this story, the ugly, disintegrating yellow wallpaper that covers the narrator's bedroom becomes both a catalyst and symbolic echo of the narrator's disintegrating mind. She is suffering over the so-called rest cure, which was an appalling medical treatment that actually was, unfortunately, forced on plenty of women in the late 19th century in order to treat postpartum depression. And under the rest cure, the narrator has been confined against her will to the room with yellow wallpaper and instructed that she must not write or exercise or leave the room, basically. And here's a passage from the story describing the color of the wallpaper. It is the strangest yellow, that wallpaper. It makes me think of all the yellow things I ever saw, not beautiful ones like buttercups, but old, foul, bad yellow things. A smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow turning sunlight. It reminds one of a fungus. So obviously, this is diametrically opposed to the color yellow's associations in Crimson Peak. Here, it's evoking illness and rot, both physical and mental. In fact, the color is so much like an illness that it's contagious. It spreads onto the narrator's clothes. My sister-in-law said that the paper stained everything it touches, and that she had found yellow smooches on all my clothes and my husband's. In fact, color is often presented as nastily contagious in American horror fiction. We might think of Robert Chambers' short story collection, The King in Yellow, where a cursed play called The King in Yellow as well spreads madness, quote, like an infectious disease to all who read it. Or recall Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Masque of the Red Death, which we saw enacted in the clip from Phantom of the Opera. The Red Death is the name of the plague that kind of rudely interrupts the party in costumed form. And finally, there's H.P. Lovecraft's 1927 short story, The Color Out of Space, in which a meteor lands on a remote New England farm and slowly spreads a plague of otherworldly color throughout the countryside, leaving everything in its wake dead or worse. This is how the narrator of Lovecraft's story describes the color. A faint phosphorescence had begun to pervade the entire apartment. It glowed on the broad planked floor and the fragments of rag carpet and shimmered over the sashes of the small paved windows. It ran up and down the exposed corner posts, coruscated about the shelf and mantel, and infected the very doors and furniture. So the language of contagious spread is again front and center. And as many of you will know, and has been increasingly discussed in recent years, rightly so, Lovecraft was a giant racist, exceptionally so even for his era. And among other revolting beliefs, he thought it was wrong for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to miscegenate with pretty much anyone else. So even though Color Out of Space is actually one of his less explicitly racist stories, I find it personally impossible not to find echoes of his bigotry in a tale where the bad color from out there spreads like wildfire among a bunch of white New Englanders, wreaking havoc everywhere. And unfortunately, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the author of The Yellow Wallpaper, also held racist views. So she belonged to eugenicist societies and was openly anti-immigrant. The scholar Susan Lanzer has actually argued that the creeping invasive color from the yellow wallpaper is a specific reference to the racial others that Gilman feared. And this is because it wasn't uncommon in the 1890s for racist white people to apply the term yellow to Asian immigrants, but also to Jews and to light-skinned African Americans. We might think, for instance, of the racist term yellow peril, but we might also think of the yellow stars of David that Nazis forced Jews to wear during the Holocaust. So when we pay attention to color in all kinds of its contexts, including its cultural context, we begin to see the ways in which racism, the fear of other hues, is baked into the canon of American Gothic fiction. But of course, people of color are also not just passive victims in the story of the genre. They're actively engaging with and rewriting the legacy of Lovecraft and his ilk with Gothic art of their own. This is just a small sampling of the fiction, film, and TV from the past 4 years that's been produced by people of color. So TV shows like Lovecraft Country and novels like Mexican Gothic are explicitly rewriting the weird fiction and Gothic genre on the terms of people of color. The image on the far right in yellow is from a recent portrait series by Kehinde Wiley, an American painter who's most famous for painting President Barack Obama's White House portrait. The image on the far right, though, was part of a show from this year called The Yellow Wallpaper. And Wiley has said that he was indeed explicitly referencing the Gilman story when he called it that. In the portraits from this series, Wiley is repurposing aesthetic traditions that were historically welcoming only to white people. So Gothic fiction like Gilman's short story, but also the floral wallpaper designs of Englishman William Morris, which are explicitly being referenced in the sort of trellised florals of these paintings here. Into these previously Eurocentric materials, Wiley is injecting both Black subjects and a much more vibrant color palette than is typically found in Morris's wallpaper. And some critics have noted that the colors in these paintings, in fact, echo West African textile prints. So the series by Wiley is a sort of dizzying juxtaposition of ugly history and physical beauty. Wiley is combining the Gothic history of women's oppression and racism with vibrant colors and beautiful, powerfully postured subjects. And this is the intriguing paradox at the center of Gothic art, whether it's film, literature, or painting. Even as we scream or cringe or gasp at a horror movie's kind of unpleasant subject matter, the genre's best crafted sentences and film sequences offer us the pleasure of artistic beauty and adrenaline thrills. Last year's film adaptation of the Lovecraft short story, Color Out of Space, chose this pretty but unsettling magenta hue to represent the eponymous alien color that comes in and destroys the countryside. Paying attention to color in horror reminds us that beauty can be terrible and terror can be beautiful. And after all, both beauty and terror transport us beyond our mundane reality to realms we've never seen before. Thanks so much for listening. Here are my website and Ko-fi and Twitter again. I'd love to connect with you elsewhere, and more of my writings available on my website.